Japan, a country of immense history, culture, and most importantly, history. History. Yeah, let's do that. Japan has history. Wait, sorry. I accidentally got the AP World History Summary. I genuinely think there was only one example of Japanese history pre-1870 for the entirety of the school year, and that was because they traded with the Dutch, which is not Eurocentric at all, right, College Board? Okay, let's try that one again. The history of Japan begins 23 million years ago. At that point, Japan was part of the Eurasian mainland. And then across the course of the next 22 million years, it initiated divorce proceedings with the rest of Asia, and went to go live by itself as a strong independent island chain. Humans first reached Japan nearly 40,000 years ago, during the Paleolithic era. Then they discovered agriculture along with the rest of the world, entering the Neolithic era. Small tribal groups became small kingdoms into larger kingdoms, and eventually someone managed to centralize it into an empire. That empire falls apart, another group takes power. Oh looky, it's a dynasty system. And then someone forgets to have enough money to pay the army, local rulers hired their own personal armies, and now we have a feudal system, with a pretty weak central government, and lots of lords, and in the place of knights are samurai. Then in 1274, the Mongols decide it would be a great idea to invade Japan. They lose. And then 7 years later, they decide to give it another go, and lose again. And then things basically stay pretty samey with governments changing hands until the 1600s, when the Tokugawa shogunate takes power, relegating the emperor to a pretty basically ceremonial role and ruling the country as a sort of military junta. During this time, the Americans and Europeans show up and strong-arm Japan into what were essentially the Unequal Treaties Light Edition. Now, that made lots of people sad, especially the hardcore nationalists, and so they decided to restore the monarchy to its former glory during the Meiji Revolution in 1870. This has absolutely no consequences in the future, and Japan continues being incredibly peaceful well into the future. Japan rapidly industrializes and becomes a major world power. Then they become so peaceful that they attempt to convince other countries around them to join their ideology of pacifism during the late 30s and early 40s, with varying levels of success, which doesn't go to plan. So now they have to create a new constitution in 1947 that relegates the monarch to being a ceremonial figurehead again, while creating a bicameral legislature with all the real legislative power. And then that government sticks around to the present day, and here we are. Demographics. Now, this is a very healthy population pyramid. Now, here's the pyramid of America, and as you'll see, many of the population pyramids of the Western world look pretty similar. But now, here's the Japanese population pyramid. In 2 words, it's Jover. Japan has absolutely terrible population growth, and despite the best efforts of its government, that hasn't really changed. After all, who would have thought that just telling people to have more kids, while whacking them with crippling inflation and terrible wages, wouldn't increase the birth rate? Apparently not the prime ministers of Japan. Oh, but you may ask, what if I don't like those youngsters? After all, they keep on trampling my lawn and bringing down the property value. And to that, let me tell you a little story. Once upon a time, there was a man who hated children, and so never had any of his own. But when he got old, he had no kids to take care of him. So one day, he slipped and fell in the bathtub, and the police only found him 2 months later. So really, in short, what Japan has is a rapidly aging population, without any younger generations to support them. When it comes to resources, Japan has a little something called no resources, which has never led to any conflicts in the past over resources. And besides them having practically no mineral wealth to speak of, what they do have a lot of is fish and trees, and that is the entire extent of Japanese natural resources. Japan is a highly developed country with a score of 0.925 on the UN's Human and Development Index, and it has the 5th largest GDP in the world. And interestingly, the two sectors that contribute most to the Japanese economy are, in order, anime and VTubing. Just kidding. Ah, how nice it must be to spread misinformation on Twitter. In reality, Japan has a very strong manufacturing sector that specializes in high-end goods and things that have complicated production processes, like a lot of electronic and automotive components, as well as they have a very strong services sector, making Japan's economy pretty diverse and resilient. Japan is also one of the leading countries in the world when it comes to automation. Because of their population woes, they need to automate a lot of processes, and when it comes to automation, almost anything you can think of in Japan has been automated, from production of goods, to waiting tables, to serving ice cream. Well, okay, maybe Japan isn't that far ahead. Japan has a constitutional monarchy, with the constitutional part being a parliamentary system. A bicameral legislature makes up the legislative branch, collectively called the National Diet, with the House of Representatives making up the lower house, with 465 seats, and the House of Councillors making up the upper house, with 248 seats. The House of Representatives is generally more powerful than the House of Councillors, as the Prime Minister is mostly chosen by the lower house, and they have much more power to force legislation through compared to the upper house. The legislative branch of the government is headed by the Prime Minister, chosen by the National Diet, along with up to 14 other ministers of state appointed by the Prime Minister. Under the Constitution of Japan, these ministers are functionally in charge of the executive branch, but the majority of decisions are made by the Prime Minister, with the ministers of state mostly being there to execute their roles in the day-to-day operation of the government. Now, the judicial branch is actually a 4-tier system with summary courts on the bottom and the Supreme Court all the way on top. Japan actually doesn't have a jury-based judicial system, which is better or worse for rule of law depending on how you see it. The judicial branch has quite a bit of independence from the executive, but once every 10 years, voters can choose to have their judge removed if they want, and the Supreme Court does have the power of judicial review over the legislative and executive branches. While technically the head of state in Japan is the emperor, he in reality doesn't have very much power because of a minor incident in the past. And the head of government is the Prime Minister, who takes over most of the roles that the head of state usually would, and has all the real power. And in terms of electoral competitivity, Japanese elections are pretty competitive, and there isn't any voter intimidation or any vote rigging or anything like that, and anyone can win if they're popular, so all in all, it's pretty democratically competitive. Japan is actually very interesting in its political party system, as it has a fairly multi-party system, despite the fact that a single party has pretty much held power from 1955 to the present day, with the exception of only 2 election cycles. Which does sound suspiciously like a dominant party system, but it actually is a multi-party system. Now, that party in question is the Liberal Democratic Party, or LDP for short. And because Japan is weird with party colors like the US, for some reason their color scheme is red and green, despite being a fairly far-right conservative party. They're the dominant party in the country, partially due to slightly dubious electoral district distribution that favors rural areas, as well as Japan being a fairly conservative country in general. But if it were just up to them, the LDP actually couldn't form a majority by themselves, as they hold almost but not quite 50% of the seats in both houses, and so actually need allies to get things passed. And so these allies in question is the party of Komeito, or the New Komeito Party, or Kome, or the NKP for short. Their color scheme is pink, which is actually aesthetically very nice, and much better than the now defunct Traffic Light Coalition in Germany. Now, the politics of Kome are economically centrist with socially conservative themes, but they are they have a weird combination of being conservative and progressive simultaneously, so it's kind of weird. But what their main theme is humanitarianism. And since 1999, they've worked in a coalition with the LDP, and the two of them get along pretty well.
The anarchists, the agitators, the looters, and people who, in many instances, have absolutely no clue what they are doing.
Now, onto the opposition. There's three major left-wing opposition parties. I mean, major might be a bit shady, but it's major enough. Which, in order of strength, are the Constitutional Democratic Party, Social Democratic Party Coalition, or CDP-SDP, the Japanese Communist Party, or JCP, and Reiwa. The CDP and SDP merged in order to provide a more united opposition against the LDP, which means that technically the SDP doesn't have many seats, because those seats are controlled by the CDP, but still with SDP members. And the CDP-SDP is a pretty standard left-wing opposition. It's pretty big tent, because it might actually have a chance at government someday, and as far as party politics go, it's progressive and economically center-left. The Japanese Communist Party, on the other hand, is far left and has a surprising amount of representation in the legislature. They're Marxist fundamentalists and don't really approve of that new kid on the block, Marxist-Leninism, or the one-party system of the Soviet Union and China. Reiwa, the smallest party of the three, is kind of between the JCP and CDP-SDP in terms of politics, and they subscribe to left-wing populism, which is kind of like, it's pretty socialist, but it's not quite there. There are also two conservative opposition parties, the Japan Innovation Party and the Democratic Party for the People, both populist, and they don't really like the LDP's stranglehold on Japanese politics. Okay. I know I talked about this earlier, but bear with me here. You guys know by now that Japan has some serious problems with its population and population growth, with the number of elderly people about to reach critical mass and collapse the society that is trying to support them. And to be fair, the Japanese government is trying its best to encourage population growth. They've offered cash to new parents, but for the most part, Japan is focusing on trying to use immigration to bolster population figures and worker shortages. And with around 3% of the current population being born in a foreign country. After all, even if more people have kids, they won't actually be able to enter the workforce for another 20 to 24 years. And an example of this is in 2018, when then Prime Minister Shinzo Abe passed legislation intending to bring 345,000 foreign workers into Japan over the course of 5 years. And as well as that, the government has consistently tried to increase the amount of students and workers to fulfill certain labor shortages in crucial sectors. However, Japan still has a lot of problems with immigration, because despite the comparatively high standard of living and benefits that immigrants get, Japan doesn't actually try very hard to integrate immigrants into the country. For example, many immigrants can't actually become naturalized citizens of Japan, and the process of becoming a citizen is really difficult. And as well as that, Japan doesn't have any anti-discrimination laws or judicial bodies, and workplaces often discriminate. As an example of this is that immigrants can often earn 28% less than native Japanese workers. But Japan isn't exactly unfriendly towards immigrants. They're actually quite receptive. The Japanese people in general don't think immigrants are bad, despite what some sources like to say. But from an outside perspective, the Japanese government still isn't making that much of an attempt to try and incentivize. Article 9 of the Constitution of Japan It's been one of the core tenets of Japanese foreign policy for the past 70 years. But it's not particularly long, only 4 lines on its Wikipedia page. And it's such a crucial part of political debate and political ideology, so it would probably be bad for me to skip over it. But why does this article matter so much, while the other 102 articles of the Constitution really don't in the same way? To figure that out, we first need to ask, what exactly is Article 9? Aspiring sincerely to an international peace based on justice and order, the Japanese people forever renounce war as a sovereign right of the nation and the threat or use of force as means of settling international disputes. In order to accomplish the aim of the preceding paragraph, land, sea, and air forces, as well as other war potential, will never be maintained. The right of belligerency of the state will not be recognized. In short, Japan doesn't get to have a military. But you may wonder, how is this a problem? After all, war is bad, and if a country says in its constitution that they won't give themselves the resources to wage war, that's good for the peace of the world in general. Which is nice and all. It's cute of you that you believe that. But Japan has 2 neighbors, who, let's just say, are slightly militaristic. But enough about other countries. What makes this a big problem in Japan? So Japan has 2 major political blocs. The LDP government, who have been in charge of the government for quite a long time, and the liberal and the left-wing opposition. The opposition tends to be much more pacifist and doesn't want Article 9 to change. They support really giving the military less money, so as to not go the way of America, where they pump like bajillions of dollars into building into Raytheon and Lockheed Martin. But the LDP does want the capability, if push comes to shove, that Japan can defend itself against North Korea and China. And so, due to that, they want to amend Article 9 to include the Japanese Self-Defense Force as a recognized military defense force for the country. In its current state, the JSDF kind of exists in a sort of Schrodinger's military, as it exists, as well as not existing. And the ruling party kind of wants to clarify that role, but can't quite get the supermajority needed to amend the Constitution. When it comes to external forces pushing on Japan, there's really 2 major players, the United States and China, whose end goals are both pretty much mutually exclusive. When the US wants to slap a bunch of military bases in Japan, China naturally doesn't want that. When the US wants Japan to trade less with China and more with the US, China doesn't want that. And as well as the petty squabbles that go on between the US and China, which always somehow ends up getting the Japanese involved, Japan has a pretty big factor that encourages it to keep its self-defense force up to date, North Korea. Because every once in a while, everyone's best friend, Lil Kimmy, he throws a little temper tantrum and launches a prototype ballistic missile over Japan, which is not exactly fun for the Japanese, and so they need to sacrifice large quantities of money to the heathen gods of Lockmart and Raytheon. Okay, time for the land of the tea drinking. Oh? What is this?
Oh no! Oh no!
What's wrong?
Not talk too many people.
Fine. Well, what country do we do then? Oh, okay, I've got it. Russia, land of bears, vodka, and bears drinking vodka. But how does Japan's government compare to the Russian government? When it comes to the government of both of those countries, they both have dual executive systems. But the head of state in Russia is the one with all the real power, while the head of the government in Japan is the person who moves the country instead of the emperor. post-production me here. I know this project is only supposed to be 20 minutes long, and that's the hard cap. So if you want to just stop right here, go ahead. But then, what will you guys do with the next 15 to 20 minutes of class? After all, many of the other groups probably didn't go all the way up to the limit. So it would be really cool if I could just take over their time like some sort of time cannibal. Cheers. Post-production me out. You could argue that both countries technically have a dominant party system. I mean, it looks that way on paper, because one party consistently wins all the elections. But while Japanese elections are pretty legitimate, and political opponents can oppose the government without fear of punishment, in Russia, many political opponents, or even people who could be potential political opponents, feel the call of nature, and leap out of windows as if they were birds. Or that's at least what the Kremlin investigations say. As well as that, Russia is a federal democracy on paper, while Japan is a unitary state. And Japan's upper house is much more powerful than the Russian upper house, because the Japanese upper house is directly elected by the people. Anyways, I've probably rambled on long enough, so bye-bye, and until next time, and remember, please don't hit the like button or the subscribe button because I don't actually want any engagement on this channel. Okay, have fun.